Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome to my PostCSS crash course. So PostCSS is something that's been around for quite a while, and it's integrated in quite a few tools that you've probably used, such as Next.js, Parcel, Vite, and many other tooling software. In fact, PostCSS actually has more NPM installs than TypeScript. It has more installs than Sass or Less or any other preprocessors all put together. But I only recently really started to dive into PostCSS and all the different plugins. So I figured I'd make a crash course talking about it. We'll go through some slides and then we'll jump in and I'll show you how to start using it. Okay, so we're just going to spend a couple minutes in some slides just to talk about what PostCSS is and how it works and so on. So as far as what it is, it's a tool for transforming your CSS using JavaScript plugins. So there's plugins for just about anything that you can think of, and you can look at the catalog at postcss.parts. So an example of a plugin would be like the Autoprefixer plugin, which, like the name says, will automatically add vendor prefixes where needed. So PostCSS is used to automate a lot of your CSS tasks. And I'm going to show you maybe 5 or 6 different plugins and how to use them. So PostCSS is not the same as a preprocessor like Sass. I'm going to talk more about that in a minute. It's used in many of the popular tooling software that many of you are probably using, like Next.js, Vite. It's often used with Webpack and task runners like Gulp. It's really all over the place when it comes to front-end development. And like I said, it uses JavaScript plugins to modify your CSS output, so there's no need for like any kind of external compiler or preprocessor. Now, just a little bit more on how PostCSS actually works. So it actually takes a CSS file and converts it into something called an AST, or an abstract syntax tree, which is a structured tree of nodes that parses strings of CSS and then represents them with JavaScript objects. Okay, and then PostCSS has an API which allows JavaScript plugins to access that AST and then update properties and provide a different output for your CSS. So this allows you to add things like vendor prefixes or whatever you want your plugins to do. So a plugin is just a JavaScript function that receives a node tree as an argument, transforms it, and then returns the modified tree. And if you're pretty good with JavaScript and CSS, then you can easily create your own PostCSS plugins as well. In fact, that sounds like a good idea for a tutorial. Now, a lot of people get confused when it comes to PostCSS versus a preprocessor like Sass or Less. A preprocessor is a program that lets you generate CSS from the processor's own unique syntax. So a Sass file, for instance, or an SCSS file is compiled into valid CSS and then inserted into your HTML file. So you do have that overhead of a Sass compiler, or Less, or whatever it is. There's a lot of them. Sass is just the most popular. So PostCSS, even though it sounds like it, it's not a post processor. The name PostCSS refers more to like beyond CSS. It's more like what Babel is to JavaScript. It parses CSS, loads plugins, and manages these transformations. So in your head, you can kind of think of PostCSS as a box that you can put your normal CSS style sheet into, and you can have specific JavaScript plugins in that box to do certain things, and then it stringifies it, it outputs it into just another valid CSS file, and then you can include that in your HTML. You know, where Sass is essentially its own language that compiles to CSS. Now, if you wanted to, you could actually load Sass or any other preprocessor using PostCSS. However, you can achieve the same type of functionality that Sass offers using plugins. In fact, I'm going to show you one called PreCSS that allows you to pretty much do everything you can do with Sass. And those of you that know me, you know that I'm not one to say that X is better than Y, or you should use X and ditch Y. There's different developers, different situations, different projects, and they all can use different solutions. So I'm not going to say, well, stop using Sass and move to PostCSS. If you want to stick with Sass, that's absolutely fine. I'm just giving you the option and showing you how it works. And I do have a Sass crash course as well. All right, so like I said, I'm going to show you some of the plugins when we jump into some code, but just to mention them real quick. So Autoprefixer, we already talked about that. It will generate any needed presets. postcss-preset-env is a plugin that allows you to use the latest cutting-edge CSS features that aren't yet supported in the browser. So things like nesting and custom selectors, etc. It's pretty much like the preset-env plugin for Babel for JavaScript. So PreCSS is a plugin that allows you to use Sass-like syntax. It does depend on other plugins. In fact, one of those is the preset-env plugin, and then there's some others as well, like 5 or 6, but it lets you literally use Sass syntax, including the $ variables, nesting, extending, things like that. Then you have style lint, which is a CSS linter that validates your styling and helps you avoid errors. PostCSS Assets is an asset manager, so you can define load paths, and the plugin will look up the assets that you need, so images and background images and so on. And then CSSNano optimizes and minifies your CSS files for production. So we're going to pretty much look at all of these. And there's tons more. Like I said, if you go to postcss.parts, I believe is the URL, you'll see a catalog of just a ton of different plugins. All right, so that's it. Let's go ahead and jump in and learn PostCSS. All right, guys, so this is postcss.org. This is where you can find all the documentation and all that. If you click on plugins, that will take you to postcss.parts, and there's a categorized list of different plugins. So if we look at like fonts, you can see all the plugins that have to do with different font stuff. So there's some really cool things here that can really help your workflow. Now, as far as using PostCSS, like I said, it's integrated into a lot of different tooling. It's used a lot with like Webpack and Vite. So if you go to, let's see, if we go to setup, I believe that takes us to the GitHub page. And here it'll show you how to get started with like Parcel. So with Webpack, Gulp. What we're going to be using is just the PostCSS CLI, and that will allow us to use it without having to use like Webpack or any of those build tools. If you're just creating like a regular static website, but you want to use PostCSS, then you would probably use the PostCSS CLI. You wouldn't really use something like Webpack for just a regular static website. All right, so that's what we're going to be using. So I'm going to just go ahead and jump in. Actually, let's open that browser back up and just make this a little smaller, and I'm just going to open up a new tab. So in VS Code, I have just an empty folder called postcss crash, and then I'm going to open up my integrated terminal, and from here we're going to run npm init I'm just going to do -y as well, just to create a package.json file, because we do have to install postcss along with some dependencies, including the plugins. But first thing we're going to do is npm install, and we can install these as dev dependencies because they're for development. So let's say postcss, and then I'm also going to install the postcss-CLI. Okay, so we'll get those installed. And then we need to figure out what do we want for our file structure. So a common thing to do is to have a source folder. So let's create a folder called source. And then inside that, I'm going to have my CSS file, which I'm going to call this input.css. And you don't have to call it this. You can call it whatever you want, but that's what it is. It's the CSS that we're going to input into PostCSS, which again, you can think of as a box that has JavaScript plugins to manipulate it, or change things up, add things, and then output another file. And that file is going to be in a folder called dist. So I'm just going to create a new folder here called dist, and we don't actually have to create the output CSS file. What we do need to do is go into our package.json, and then from here, let's create a script. So you can call this whatever you want. I'm going to call it build: CSS, and let's get rid of, let's get rid of all this. And then what we want to run is PostCSS, and you have to have the CLI installed to be able to do this. So PostCSS, and what we want to look at for our input is source/input.css. That's the file we want to look at. And then we want to define the output, so I'm going to say -o, and then the output is going to be a file called dist/ and then style.css, or whatever you want to call it. Okay, so that will build it. Now, if you just use this script, what's going to happen is every time you edit your CSS, you're going to have to come here and run npm run build CSS in order for it to build. But it does have a watch flag that we can use. So what I'm going to do is just copy this whole thing and then paste that in. Make sure you put a comma there. And then let's change this to watch CSS. And at the very end here, I'm just going to add a -w. So what that'll do is just constantly watch your input, and any changes you make, it'll then, it'll create your dist or your output. So let's save that. And then we don't have any plugins yet, so it's not really going to do anything except create our output. But let's just try it. We'll just say body, and let's say background. We'll say background color. Let's do white. All right. Now, if I save that, you'll see nothing happens. It didn't create the file because I have nothing running. If I want to build it, I can say npm run build. Let's say build:CSS. And now if I look in my dist folder, we have a style CSS, which right now looks the exact same. It does have this source mapping URL, but we can ignore that. We're not dealing with source maps. But this is the file you would include in your HTML. So what I would do here is in my dist folder, create my index.html. And let's just add some boilerplate here. And I'll just say Traversy Media for the title. And then we want to include our style sheet, which is going to be just style.css. So we're including the output. That's important. You don't want to include your source input. So let's save that. And then what I'll do is just open this with Live Server. Okay, and I don't know, in the body we'll just put, let's do an H2, and I'll just say Traversy Media. Okay, so now let's install a plugin. So we'll go ahead and use the Autoprefixer plugin first. So I'm going to come down here in my terminal, and let's clear it up. We'll say npm install as a dev dependency, and then Autoprefixer. Now the second step after installing a plugin is to add it to your config. So we do have to create in the root here, we're going to create a post, is that in the root? Yeah, so we're going to create a postcss.config.js file. And from here we want to just do a module exports, and we're exporting an object, and in that object we're going to have a plugins array. Okay, and then in that array, we just want to require whatever the plugin we're using, in this case, Autoprefixer. Okay, so I'm going to save that, and we can close that up for now, and we should be able to use that. Now, as far as the Autoprefixer plugin, what it does is it uses the caniuse.com website, where you can search for a CSS feature or a JavaScript feature and see which browsers support it. So for example, Flexbox, which just about every browser supports. But if we use it, if we look at like placeholder, so the placeholder pseudo selector, and if I make this a little bigger and we look at Chrome, you'll see it says partial support with prefix WebKit. You can see that on the left there. So what I want to do is use that placeholder pseudo selector in our CSS. But in our HTML, let's just do, we don't have to add this, but we'll just add, let's say form, and then an input. We'll just do input text, and then I'll add a placeholder, and we'll say enter a search term. Okay, and then let's go into our input CSS. Make sure you're in your input, not your style.css. And let's go ahead and just say input, double double colon and then placeholder. And let's set the color to something else. We'll set it to red. Now, if I save that and I look at my style.css, it's not there. That's because we didn't run the build command, right? But instead of running build, because then we'd have to keep running it, let's run watch. So we'll say npm run watch :css. And you can see that it's watching it down here, and this turned red. And if I go ahead and I change this, let's change it to, let's say, steel blue and save. Since I'm using live server as well, it just turns blue, okay? And it's watching our input. It's doing what it does with the plugins, with Autoprefixer, and then it's outputting style CSS. And if we look at this, not only do we have input placeholder, but we also have the MOZ prefix, okay? And it's going to be different. Like if you use border radius, for instance, this doesn't really make much sense, but if I do like border radius 5 pixels, and we look in style CSS, it doesn't use the prefix for that because you don't need that anymore, essentially. I'm going to get rid of that and make sure you're not editing your style CSS. That's your output. So that's Autoprefixer, and that's how you use plugins. You just install it, you add it to the config. Some will have options where you can set a parentheses after it, and then you can add some options, but we don't really need any options for that. So let's install another plugin. Now I'm going to install the postcss-preset-env plugin, which will allow us to use basically the most cutting edge features of CSS that aren't yet implemented in browsers or in many browsers. So I'm going to stop the watch command, and let's say npm install -d, and this is called postcss-preset-env. Okay, now I'm not going to run watch yet because we do have to add this to our config, and whenever you change your config file, you have to restart the watch or it won't take effect. So let's go ahead and I'll just put this on a new line, and let's copy that down, and then we want to require the postcss-preset-env. Now this one does take options, so if we put our parentheses and then curly braces, what we're going to define here is the stage. So with CSS and JavaScript features, when they come out, they're in different stages. So I think the default here is stage 2, and the stuff that I want to use, like the custom selectors, they're not available in stage 2, so I'm going to set this to stage 1. You could also do stage 0, but that's like really cutting edge stuff that might not even be in CSS. So let's go ahead and save this, and then I'm going to run the watch command. And then let's go over to our input, and not only is this a tutorial on PostCSS, but I'll also show you some of the cool features that are coming to CSS. First is going to be the custom selector. So at the top here, I can say custom-selector, and the way that we format this is with a : and then whatever we want to call this, I'm going to call it heading, and let's do H1, H2, H3, H4, H5, and H6. Okay, and then let's come down here, and what I'll do is add in the : heading, and then any style I put in here, like let's say font size 40, should apply to all of the headings. So you can see my Traversy Media here gets bigger. And if I go into my HTML, what I'm going to do is actually under the form, I'm going to have a card class, and in here let's do H3. We'll say welcome, and then I'm going to do a paragraph with just some dummy text. That's all the HTML we need for this. And notice that even though it's an H3, that style's still applied because it's a custom selector that is selecting all of these, H1 through H6. Now, in addition to custom selectors, we have custom media queries. So we can say custom-media, and we're going to do -- viewport. So this is just what I'm calling it. We can call it viewport-medium, and then we want to specify the media query, which is going to be the width is going to be greater than or equal to 500 pixels. Now, wherever I want to use this, let's say I only want the font size for the headings to be 40 pixels if the width is less than or equal to 500. So in that case, I could just say media, and then we want to put the name of our custom media, which is viewport-medium. Actually, I guess that would be viewport-small. Yeah, let's do that. Let's change this to small. Okay, and then we just want to wrap. I'm going to wrap this font size here. And now if I make this bigger, you'll see that it only kicks in when it's 500 pixels or less. So pretty cool. And then the last feature I want to show you is nesting. So if we have, remember we have our card class, right? So let's say card, and I love nesting. That's probably the biggest reason that I would use Sass, but now you don't even have to. So in the HTML, let's see, we have an H2 and an H3. Let's actually make this an H2 as well, because I want to target just this H2 inside of card. So what I can do is, with CSS, regular CSS and not Sass, you do have to add an ampersand. So I would have to do ampersand H2, and then let's say color red. If I save that, now only the H2 inside the card is red. Now with Sass, you don't have to have this, but you'll see you do need it with CSS. However, the next plugin I'm going to show you, called PreCSS, it gives you basically the same syntax as Sass for a lot of things, nesting, variables, etc. So that's what I want to show you next. So let's stop the watch, and let's say npm install -d, and then it's going to be PreCSS. And they call it that because, like, preprocessor, I guess. And before I run watch, I just want to add it to this right here. So let's say require, and we want to require PreCSS. Okay. Now, when I run this, we might get a message here. Yeah, so it gives you this message that says, please update to version 7 of postcss-preset-env. So basically, they haven't updated their version of preset-env. There is an issue on the GitHub page for this, but it doesn't. You can still use it just fine, but they just haven't updated to the latest version. Because like I said, this depends on a few other plugins. But now we should be able to go to, let's go to our input CSS, and let's say we want to create a variable for the background color. Right now in regular CSS, you can use custom properties. You can do, like, you can say root, and then you can say -- whatever, light color, whatever the variable name. But it's kind of, I don't like the syntax, because then when you use it, you have to use var. I like the variable syntax in Sass. So here we should now be able to just say, let's call it light color, and we'll set that to, let's set it to just, I don't know, that. And then if I want to use it, I can just come down here and I can say light-color, save that. And did that work? I can't tell. Let's change it to, let's say, black, just to see if it works. Yep, so you can see that that is working. Now another thing I can do is, since I'm using PreCSS, is I don't even have to use this ampersand. So for the nesting, if I go ahead and save that, now that works, which I really like. Because I'm someone that really likes Sass, but for the past, whatever, couple months, I've been using this in place of Sass. So let's see, I want to have my variables, because this is what I'll commonly do, is have all my variables inside of a separate CSS file. Because with Sass, you can use import, and it's not like using the regular CSS import where it actually, includes all the different CSS files and it can hinder performance. With this, it just imports them all, and then it ends up as one final CSS file with all the styles in it. So let's go ahead and stop the watch here. and let's say npm install, and this one is called postcss-import. All right, and then let's add it to our config. So I'm just going to copy that down and let's say postcss-import. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is in my source folder, I'm going to create a new file, and let's call it vars.css. And then I'm going to take that light color, and we'll go ahead and paste that in here. And then, of course, in our input, we need to import the vars file. So let's say, actually, we need ampersand, @ symbol, and then import, and then just the name of the file. So we don't have to put the extension or anything, just import vars. And then let's save it and run watch. And then let's go to vars, and I'm actually going to use this syntax instead of using the hyphen. So if I save that, I'm going to get an error down here. So you can see we do get errors, and it says could not resolve the variable light color. So if we go to input, let's just change this to that, and then that should work. Now I'm just going to add a couple other variables here. So let's do, we're going to do dark color, and I'm going to set that to 333, which is a really dark gray. And then for the cards, I'm going to have, let's say, border width, and for that we'll do, let's say, 2 pixels. And then let's do border, we'll do border color, and for that let's do black. And it doesn't really matter, this is going to look like crap no matter what, but let's say border radius, and for that we'll do, let's say, 5 pixels. Okay, so now we have some variables. And I want my card, so this is what I would recommend doing if you're building an interface or a website, is having your different components in different files. So for cards, we could create a new CSS file called card.css, and this is what I used to do with Sass as well. And then for, let's say, card, and I'm going to do padding 20 pixels, and you can put whatever you want inside of variables, but let's do margin top 20 pixels, and then for the border should be able to use the border width, so border width, and then let's do solid, and then you could put the border style in a variable as well, but I just did the color and the width. And then let's do, for right now, we'll do a width of 500 pixels. And let's nest in here the H2. And again, we'll just say color red. And we'll just do that for now. And then in the input, I'm going to get rid of this card styling. If I get rid of that, you'll see this is now black. But if I import, let's go under vars. Vars should be the first one so that we can use variables in other files. But let's import card, and now you can see we get our red heading, we get our border, and so on. So there's just a couple other extensions that are plugins that I want to show you. The next one is called PostCSS Assets, which allows you to manage your images and stuff. So let's install that. We'll say npm install, and it's postcss-assets. And then, of course, we need to add that to our config. So let's open that up. We can close some of this other stuff up for now. And let's bring in PostCSS Assets. And then this can take in some options. So we can put our parentheses with our curly braces. And then I'm going to set the load paths. And then you can go to the documentation because there's a lot of different options. But I'm going to set a load path in here, and this is going to be an array, but I'm going to put my dist/img path. So basically, whenever I load a background image, I want it to look in this location. So I'm going to create that. So in dist, I'll create img, And then I'm just going to bring over my logo. You can use any image you want, but I'm just going to use my logo here. And I'll probably have a repository with this stuff in it in the description. But now let's run watch. Now that we can use this PostCSS Assets plugin, and I'm going to go to, let's see, where do we want to do this? Let's go into our card CSS, and I want to add a background image of my logo. So I'm going to go right here and say background dash image. And the way we use this is with a resolve function. Okay, so obviously this is not regular CSS, but this is the syntax we can use that plugin looks at, and then we'll convert it to regular CSS. And what I can do is, instead of putting the whole path, I can just simply say logo.png, because that is going to be in my load path that I put in the config. So let's go ahead and save that, and now you'll see it shows the image. But I'm just going to set a couple other things here, like let's say background dash repeat, and we'll set that to no repeat. And then let's set, what else? Let's center it. We'll say background dash position and center. And then there are some other things we can do, like the width. The width of this, I already have width. So the width of this card, we can actually use a width function and pass in the name of the image. So in this case, logo.png. And what it'll do is it'll set the width of the card to the width of the image. Okay, it does have some padding, but it is now whatever the width of the image. And you can do the same with the height. So I can say height and then say height, which is the name of this function. And I can pass in logo.png, save it, and there we go. And there's others as well if you want to check out the docs. Now the last one I want to show you is the CSSNano plugin, and what that'll do is just optimize and minify your CSS, your output CSS. So I'm going to stop this, and let's say npm install -d, and then it's called CSSNano. And we're going to add that here to our post config. So let's see, we want to go right here and require CSSNano, and then I'm just going to add, for options, I'm going to add a preset of default. And there's others as well, again, if you want to check the docs. But what this should do is just minify my CSS. So let's go ahead and run watch, and let's take a look at our style CSS, and now it's nice and minified and optimized. All right, and you might want to, like, if you don't want it to be minified so you can actually read it, then you could just take this and comment it out. And if I save this, my input now, actually you'd have to restart the watch, but now it won't be minified. All right, but when you're in production, you're probably going to want to have this minified. So we'll just do that again, and now there we go. So those are just some of what I think are really great plugins. I keep calling them extensions, but there's so many more, so much you can do, and hopefully now you understand how to use PostCSS, and just using it the way we are with the PostCSS CLI. That's only one way. You know, if you're building a simple static website or a simple JavaScript application, but if you want to use it with Webpack or Parcel, which it's already included with, Next.js, which it's already included with, you can use these in your, with your styling. So that's it, guys. I hope you enjoyed this crash course, and I will see you next time.